Speaking of the viability of far-right candidates, Italian voters went to the polls on Tuesday, and elected Giorgia Meloni as the incoming prime minister of Italy. A lot of debate over whether to call her fascist or not.
Don't call her.
But the party, like what the history of the party, it evolved from a party that evolved from a party that evolved from Mussolini's party. She used to, in the old days, say nice things about Mussolini.
Right.
Recently, she's broken with Mussolini. She's not a fan of Mussolini. She's pro EU. She's kind of
pro NATO,
pro the Ukraine war, or pro the Ukraine side of the war. And there were some jokes on Twitter. I don't know if there were jokes on Twitter when Zelensky's like, "Congratulations!" A bunch of people on the left are like, "See, we told you he was a Nazi." Hey, look, they're buddying up with this other Nazi down here in Italy.
Yeah, those weren't jokes.
And so there was kind of a left-wing working class kind of coalition that was running as well, kind of the Five-Star movement, which used to be, which started as kind of a post-partisan, kind of populist-ish type of thing that was mostly left-coded, but some right populism. When they got into power, they implemented a universal basic income, particularly down in the South, and did a bunch of other things that really tried to appeal to the material interests of the working class. Meloni really very much appealing to the cultural interests, anti-immigrant, what you would generously call pro-family. And it seems like by at least a 3-to-1 margin, the working class voters were more moved by the cultural elements that she was offering than what the Five-Star folks were bringing. And one of her first acts was to just nix the universal basic income, like done with that. So what do we draw from this about where our confusing kind of working class material versus cultural politics are headed?
It's so interesting from an American perspective. I think we try to sometimes graft the American left-right dichotomy onto elections where there are way more than the two-party system. Mm-hmm. So, like, if your choice is Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, the handicap there is we're suddenly acting as though the entire country loves Donald Trump or hates Hillary Clinton, and that's just not the case. It's always more nuanced than that. And this example is so instructive because of exactly the dynamic you just said, that cultural issues prove to be more salient for how much of the vote did she win? 28%, 26, 28. Yeah, that chunk of the voter base, but that's not a resounding majority. I mean, far from it. Enough to win the election, but not exactly a majority. And then when you juxtapose it side by side with the working class party, what's interesting about that is it shows particularly, I think, what the American right misses, which is that, and what the left really misses, which is that the culture war can be kind of the big tent. That's something we say at the Federalists a lot. The culture is the big tent because people's interests, their sort of material, financial interests, those two things go together. So if you can't speak your mind at work without fear of losing your job, and you need the job, or you can't talk about you feel like you can't talk about your faith. Whether or not you can actually do it is different than whether you feel like you can do it. So take something like Meloni talks about people's faith or their patriotism. People feel like they can't talk about that without suffering financial consequences. Right. Those two things are actually completely intertwined, and the left does a really poor job, I think, of recognizing that and addressing it by also tackling the sort of really discomforting, alienating culture.
And coding immigration as purely cultural is probably part of that too, because in Europe you have a lot of left-wing parties now.
The Sweden Democrats,
pretty anti-immigrant.
Yeah. I mean, this happened. I don't think people. I mean, I don't know. It's difficult to like graft the left-right dichotomy from America into. But this is on the heels of what happened in Sweden. It also reminded me a lot of what we covered previously in France, with the juxtaposition of like National Front, Marine Le Pen, and also you have a sort of far left. You can't really call Bernie candidate, but kind of in that vein, doing okay at the same time, and that's really the real competition. Macron benefits from it because you have these two, the split between those two. But yeah, immigration, that's exactly, I think, the point. It illustrates the point so well, because there are people's both cultural and material concerns on the table, and to dismiss that as bigotry, necessarily as bigotry, and not as possibly anything else, reasonable, good faith disagreement. And you can disagree about the politicians, whether they're coming to it in good faith, but voters, that's a different question. And I just think the left is struggling so much right now, and Europe is a great example. They have yet to muster a really good response.
Yeah, and in some ways the parliamentary system allows you to draw out a little bit more of the texture and the distinctions in ways that are obscured here. AOC famously said a couple years ago, if we were in Europe, I wouldn't be in the same party as Joe Manchin, which was taken as like a shot, but also just a fact. Like that's just an objective fact. They would be in different parties. And so there was a center-left kind of technocratic party in Europe, I think led by a guy named Latta, who refused to kind of link up with the more working class left parties. Because there was Italian politics is incredibly factional, but for our purposes, like the materialism behind it was related to blaming them for kind of tossing them out of power, like blaming some of these other factions for tossing them out of power years past, like just score settling and grudges. So they didn't team up, but it's not clear that they could have necessarily even teamed up, because they represent the kind of wing of the Democratic Party, what you would call the kind of upper middle class, professional class element of it, which in the U.S. Is married together in this one giant party, and so it's harder for us to see the kind of the strains in the strains that are trying to keep that together. Whereas in Italy, you can just see it much more clearly that there's a kind of both cultural and class distinction between these elements of the broad left that make it very difficult for them to team up. They just don't like each other in a lot of ways. And these center-left kind of and center-right technocratic parties in Europe are blamed for taking Europe from its boom period of the 60s, 70s to what it is now.
Well, yeah, and I think also, that's where you're going to see, I mean, we showed the subsidy cut right away. That's where you're going to see this interesting return of maybe austerity with a super pro-EU, pro-NATO, kind of pro European order, basically, you know what I mean, attached to this agenda of cultural populism, center-right cultural populism, I would say. And if we could put B5 up on the screen, that would be great, because I think this Larry Summers tweet really is the perfect tweet. He's talking about America, but he says, there's some social phenomenon which I suspect explains non-work, non-marriage, deaths of despair, general alienation, and I suspect the rise of reactionary populism. It should be a major task of social science to understand it. Yes, thank you, Larry Summers. 10 years behind the curve on that one. But I think it's just fascinating to see, to your point about the technocratic candidates.
Right.
It's fascinating how much they fail to come up or muster a legitimate, genuine, decent response in terms of policy, in terms of messaging to the rise of what Larry Summers is calling reactionary populism, precisely because, I mean, this week, the Meloni speech suddenly just gets scraped from YouTube. The same thing actually happened to Matt Taibbi. He had a video demonetized yesterday that was then restored.
Oh, right, yeah.
And then the Meloni video ultimately was restored and said it was an error. She was called the steady drumbeat of fascist, fascist, fascist. I think the New York Times had a story that used the word fascist like 28 times in the story about this woman who loves the EU and NATO. So it just, if that's the response, is to reflexively dismiss everybody as a fascist and bigot, the populism is not going to go anywhere. It will only grow, because that's exactly what drives it and what animates it.
And we all laughed at the Larry Summers quote, but I'm curious if we actually have the same answer, because I think we all think it's obvious. But to me, it's neoliberalism. Is that what you were, when you look at it, hey, yeah, it's you, Larry.
Absolutely,
We're all
100%.
we're all looking for the guy who did this.
Well, and I know people get frustrated because the word neoliberalism becomes used as a catch-all and sort of an easy slur for populists. But neoliberalism, I think, properly does encapsulate the cultural and the economic policies and the marriage of those that people like Larry Summers sort of just dismissed or didn't see the serious concerns of what was happening when you're hollowing out the Rust Belt, when you're deindustrializing, when you're opening up trade and borders with reckless abandon and not implementing policies that would at least be perhaps a safeguard or would do that more responsibly, getting super rich and creating this huge growth of inequality. I mean, it's neoliberalism. It's no problem saying that.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.